So the question that I'm often asked is, why is it important to intervene early? In response to that, the first thing that I would say is, it is important and it's incredibly valuable. And at the same time, working within a trauma model, it's also important to intervene much later, 16, 60 years later, and it can still be effective. But let me use the analogy of a stone, a large rock, starting to roll down a hill. If that boulder was beginning to roll and I was a few steps away from it, I could probably stop it rolling down the hill simply by placing my hand against it. But I wouldn't want to try to do that if I was standing at the bottom of the hill. Once the boulder had built up such momentum, it could cause devastation at the bottom of the hill, whereas at the top of the hill, simple pressure from my hand could stop it traveling any further. And mental illness is a bit like that as well, that sometimes if we can intervene early, that we reduce the toxic effect of that mental disorder. So for example, we see at the minute, crises all around the world. We have the humanitarian crisis currently in the Ukraine, and we have people who are experiencing rape and sexual assault, childhood sexual abuse, road traffic collisions and the like. So whenever we look at these different situations, the information, the unprocessed toxic information is already active, okay? And because it's already active, that means that within our neural system, within our brains, that it's vulnerable to change. So actually we can begin to, as therapists, to intervene right now and change and shift that material, taking some of the toxicity out of it, helping to deal with negative cognitions or unhelpful stories that the person has begun to apply to it. For example, sexual assault victims will often blame themselves. Maybe if I didn't dress a certain way, maybe if I didn't, smile at that person. But the reality is these are all narratives that create the illusion that the person has had control, whereas they haven't had control. But that's much more frightening for our brain to assert. So therefore we pretend, the brain tricks us into thinking we have control over an event. The rub is that also means that we then have to blame ourselves for that event. So early intervention work, typically in the literature, is actually anything within 3 months after the time of the trauma. And by intervening within that period of time, we can change and allow that information to become integrated to the healthy networks that an individual has. And that by doing that, we reduce then the impact that comes from that, and that impact could be manifesting in the forms of depressions, addictions, manic states, psychosis even. And so the trauma model would say that by working on the original trauma, then that begins to reduce it. In therapy, we're really only doing through one of three things. We're identifying and activating a memory network, and that makes it vulnerable to change. We're then changing it, and then we stabilize it again. And for individuals who have a healthy background, they have available resources, then whenever we process the information, it can key into the healthy resources that are already there. It brings me to the circumstance where, what if an individual hasn't healthy networks? And if that's the case, then we need to build those healthy networks. And that brings us on to the phased sort of approach to treating trauma. The part of the brain, for example, that deals with attachment is the part of the brain that in the adult deals with emotional regulation. So a child who hasn't formed healthy attachment networks hasn't downloaded the hardware and software from the parent, and therefore they find it difficult to emotionally regulate themselves. And that would be an area where the therapist would then have to pay additional attention to.